They thought she was nobody, just a tired waitress they could pour a drink over and laugh about, tossing money at her like it made them better. What they didn't know, the woman they humiliated was married to one of the most powerful mafia bosses on the coast, and he'd just seen the video. The clock above the kitchen pass read 10:47 when Mia decided the worst part of her shift was finally behind her. She had been wrong about that exactly 4 times already tonight, but hope was a stubborn thing, and she let herself feel it anyway. The Anchor and Spoon Diner sat at the edge of the Savannah docks, where the river smell crept in every time the door opened. Mia had worked here for 6 years. She knew which booth wobbled, which regular took his coffee black and bitter, and which window seat caught the last orange light before the sun gave up for the day. Tonight had been a double shift, her feet aching inside shoes she'd resoled twice, but she still moved with a kind of softness, like she had room in her to be gentle even when she was tired. She set a small white box on the counter near the register. Inside were 3 lemon tarts she'd baked at home that morning, before the world had even woken up. They were for Earl, the old dock worker who came in most nights and tipped in quarters he counted out one by one. He hadn't shown up yet, so Mia figured she'd leave them with a note. Someday, she promised herself, these little tarts would sit in a glass case in her own bakery, with her name painted on the window. Mia's Sweet Haven. She'd already picked the font. That was when the door swung open hard enough to rattle the bell off its hook. 3 young men spilled in, loud before they'd even sat down. Boat shoes, pressed collars, the easy swagger of people who had never once been told no. Mia recognized the type before she recognized the faces. Yacht Club. The marina was 2 miles down the road, and on Friday nights, the overflow drifted in here looking for cheap fries and a place to keep their party going. "Sit anywhere," she called, keeping her voice warm. "Kitchen's closing soon, so if you want food, now's the time." They took the big corner booth and ordered enough to feed 9 people. Mia brought it all without complaint, balancing plates up her arm the way she'd learned years ago. The tallest one, the one the others called Chad, kept making comments under his breath that made the other 2 laugh. She caught the word portions once, then a snort, then more laughter. She kept her face still and her hands busy. By 11:15, the other tables had emptied. The cook had already gone home. Mia flipped the sign on the door and walked back to the corner booth, where the 3 of them were still slumped and loud, half their food untouched. "I'm so sorry to rush you," she said, sliding the check onto the table. "But I have to close up now, whenever you're ready." Chad looked up at her. He had a glass of Coca-Cola in his hand, the ice mostly melted, and he was smiling in a way that didn't reach anything human behind his eyes. "You're always sorry, aren't you?" he said. "Bet you're sorry about a lot of things." The other 2 went quiet, watching. One of them, Brody, she'd hear his name later, had already lifted his phone, holding it low against the table like he was checking a message, but the little red light was on. "Just the check, sweetheart," Mia said softly. "No trouble." Chad stood. He was a head taller than her. For one strange second, she thought he was going to apologize, to fish out his wallet and end the night like a normal person. Instead, he raised the glass over her head and tipped it. The cold soda hit her scalp and ran down through her hair, over her forehead, into the collar of her uniform. It was sticky and sweet and impossibly loud in the silence, the ice clattering onto the floor at her feet. She heard the 3rd one, Hunter, burst out laughing. She heard Brody's phone, steady and recording, catching all of it. She heard Chad say something she would not let herself repeat later, not even to herself. Mia did not move. She stood very still, soda dripping off the end of her nose, and stared at a single point on the wallpaper she had looked at 1,000 times. There was a faded pattern of little anchors there. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. Chad pulled a $100 bill from his wallet, crumpled it, and threw it at her chest. It bounced off and landed in the puddle on the floor. "Keep the change," he said. "Get yourself something nice." Then they were moving, all three of them, knocking the table as they went, still laughing, the bell on the door, back on its hook now, ringing once as they spilled out into the dark. Through the window, Mia watched them climb into a low silver car and tear off toward the marina, their taillights swallowed by the night. The diner was very quiet. The river smell drifted in through the door they'd left open. Mia let out one slow breath. Then she walked to the counter, picked up the white box of lemon tarts she'd made for Earl, and set it carefully out of the way so it wouldn't get ruined. She got the mop. She got the towel for her hair. The old clock ticked above the pass, patient and indifferent, marking each second she spent on her knees wiping sticky soda off a floor she'd already cleaned twice that day. She did not cry. Not yet. There would be time for that on the drive home, where no one could see. And she had no idea, not the faintest idea, what would happen when her husband saw her face. The porch light was on when Mia pulled into the driveway. It always was, no matter how late she came home. Thomas left it burning for her, the way some men leave a note, a small, steady promise that someone was awake and waiting. She sat in the car a moment longer than she needed to. The drive home had taken 20 minutes, and she'd cried for 15 of them, the kind of crying that comes in waves and leaves you hollowed out. She'd stopped at a gas station and washed her hair in the sink as best she could, scrubbing with the pink soap from the dispenser until her scalp stung. Her uniform still smelled faintly of cola. Her eyes, she knew without looking, were swollen and red. She practiced a smile in the rearview mirror. It came out crooked. She tried again. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like the chamomile tea Thomas brewed when he couldn't sleep. He was on the couch with a book open in his lap, though she doubted he'd read a word of it. The second the door opened, he was on his feet. "There she is," he said, and then he saw her face, and the easy welcome drained out of his own. "Mia, what happened?" It wasn't a question, not really. Thomas had a way of looking at her like he could read the whole story off her skin. He was a soft-spoken man, careful with his words, the kind who managed shipping schedules and supply routes for a living, and brought that same patient attention home with him. In 10 years of marriage, she had never once heard him raise his voice. "Long shift," she said. "That's all. Some customers were rude." He crossed the room and took her hands. His thumbs found the spot on her knuckles he always rubbed, slow circles, a thing he'd done since their first year together. "Your hair's wet." "It's humid out." "Mia." She looked down at their hands. She'd married a man who noticed everything, and on most nights she loved him for it. Tonight it felt like standing in front of a window with no curtains. "It was nothing," she said. "Just kids, rich kids who'd had too much to drink. They made a mess and I cleaned it up, and now I'm home and I want to forget about it. Please." Thomas studied her for a long moment. Whatever he saw, he chose to let it rest. He pulled her in and wrapped his arms around her, and she let herself sag against his chest. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and being held by him had always felt like the safest place in the world. "Okay," he murmured into her hair. "Okay. You're home now." "I'm home now," she echoed. He ran her a bath and brought her tea and sat on the edge of the tub, talking about nothing. A leak in the shed roof, the neighbor's dog that kept digging under the fence, until the tightness in her shoulders began to ease. By the time she crawled into bed, she felt almost human again. He turned off the lamp and lay beside her, one arm draped over her waist, and she fell asleep, listening to him breathe. Thomas did not sleep. He waited until her breathing slowed and deepened, until he was certain she was gone under, and then he carefully lifted his arm and slid out of bed. In the dark hallway, he stood for a moment outside their door, listening. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock in the kitchen. He went to his study and closed the door. His phone sat on the desk where he'd left it. He picked it up, opened the local community page he half followed out of habit, and scrolled. It didn't take long. The video was already there, already moving, already gathering little numbers beneath it that climbed each time he refreshed. He pressed play. He watched his wife ask 3 young men politely to settle their bill. He watched her apologize. He watched the tall one stand, raise the glass, and pour it over her head while the others howled. He watched her go still, the soda running down her face, while she stared at something off camera and refused to give them the reaction they wanted. He watched the $100 bill bounce off her chest. He watched it a second time, then a third. Thomas set the phone down very gently, as though it might shatter, and sat in the dark with his hands flat on the desk. The warmth that lived in his face most hours of the day was simply gone, the way a light goes out. What remained was something cold and patient and entirely still. The comments under the video were already naming them. People in a town like Savannah always knew each other's business. That's the Whitfield kid. And isn't that the Kerrigan boy? And the third one's a Vance. 3 families, 3 names, 3 young men who had walked into a diner near the docks and decided that a tired woman cleaning up after them was something less than a person. They had no way of knowing whose wife she was. To them, she was nobody. A waitress in a stained uniform, easy to humiliate, easy to forget by morning. Thomas opened a drawer and took out a different phone, an old one, plain and black, the kind that wasn't tied to his name. He turned it over once in his hand. For 10 years he had kept 2 worlds from ever touching. The man who fixed the shed roof and brewed chamomile tea had never once come home with the other thing on him. He had built that wall, brick by brick, and he had been proud of it. Tonight, for the first time, he was going to reach across it. He dialed a number he knew by heart. "It's me," he said quietly when the line picked up. "I need everyone. Tomorrow. The usual place." A pause. "No, nothing's wrong with the business. This is personal." He hung up, slid the phone back into the drawer, and went to stand in the doorway of their bedroom, watching his wife sleep, his face unreadable in the dark. The building had no sign. It stood at the far edge of the port of Savannah, glass and steel, the kind of place people assumed belonged to some shipping firm or import company and never looked at twice. That was the point. The most powerful rooms in the world rarely announce themselves. Thomas arrived a little before noon in a plain, dark suit. The men at the front nodded to him without a word and let him through. He took the private elevator to the top floor, and when the doors opened, the boardroom was already full. A long mahogany table ran the length of the room, polished to a mirror shine. Around it sat 7 people, his most trusted operational directors, the ones who kept the machine running across half the East Coast. They handled the contracts no one signed in daylight, the shipments that moved through ports without ever appearing on a manifest, the quiet arrangements that made certain businesses rise and others fall. To the world, Thomas managed logistics. In this room, everyone understood what that word truly meant. He sat at the head of the table. No one spoke. They had all received the same call, and they could feel that something was different. Thomas was a man of routine, and he had never once summoned them for anything personal. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he said. His voice was calm, even, the same voice he used to ask Mia how her day had been. "I'm going to show you something. I'd like you to watch it carefully." He slid his phone to the center of the table and tapped the screen. The video began to play, the sound filling the silent room. The diner, his wife, the young man standing, the glass tipping, the laughter. No one at the table had ever met Mia, but every one of them knew Thomas had a wife, knew he guarded her existence like a treasure, knew her name was never spoken in connection with anything they did. They watched the soda run down the face of a woman they'd never seen, and one by one, they understood exactly what they were looking at. When it finished, The room was quiet enough to hear the river through the glass. A woman near the middle of the table, sharp-eyed and gray at the temples, spoke first. Her name was Delphine, and she had been with Thomas the longest. "That's her," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's her," Thomas confirmed. Delphine's jaw tightened. Around the table the others shifted, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop. These were not gentle people. The instinct that rose in them now was old and ugly, and Thomas could see it moving across their faces like weather. He raised one hand, and they stilled. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "and I want it understood from the start. We do this my way. There will be no broken bones, no fires, no one disappears. Nothing happens to these boys that could ever be traced back to this family, and nothing happens that touches my wife's name. She will never know. Is that clear?" A younger director near the end, restless, leaned forward. "With respect, after what they did, a quiet lesson isn't—" "A quiet lesson," Thomas said, "is the loudest thing in the world when it's done right." He let that settle. Anyone can throw a punch. Anyone can frighten a man for a night. That's noise. It fades. I want something they'll feel for the rest of their lives, and I want them to never fully understand how it happened to them. I want them lying awake at 50, wondering why everything fell apart that one strange autumn. He folded his hands. We are not going to hurt them. We are going to take apart everything they were handed, piece by piece, until they learn what it feels like to be small. The restless one sat back, chastened. Thomas turned to Delphine. 3 names. The community page already has them. Confirm everything before we move a finger. I want it clean. We have them. She opened a slim folder. Chad Whitfield. His father, Gerald, runs the biggest commercial real estate development outfit in the county. Half the new construction downtown is his. Heavily leveraged, though. He borrows against everything. She turned a page. Brody Carrigan. The family owns 3 luxury car dealerships. Their whole model runs on inventory moving fast through the port. And Hunter Vance. His parents own a chain of high-end fitness clubs and a country club membership they treat like a throne. Debts? Thomas asked. Everywhere. These families look rich. They live rich. But they're stretched as thin as paper. One bad month and they fold. Thomas nodded slowly. This was the thing the 3 young men had never been taught, the thing that wealth like theirs always hid. They thought money was a wall around them. They had no idea it was a rope, and that someone who understood ports and permits and contracts could pull it tight from 100 miles away, with a smile, without ever once being seen. Start with the structures, not the people, he said. Whitfield lives on permits and zoning approvals. I want every project he has flagged for review, quietly, through the shell on the harbor side, nothing in our name. Carrigan moves cars through our carrier whether he knows it or not. Find the contract and cancel it. Strand his inventory at the dock where he can see it and can't touch it. The Vance family loves their club. We'll get to the club. He stood. The directors rose with him. One more thing. Thomas buttoned his jacket. When this is over, those boys are going to apologize to my wife, in public, on their knees if I decide it, and they're going to mean it. He paused at the door. But she comes first, before any of it. I need to fix what this did to her, and money won't do that. So while you take their world apart, I'm going to be at home, being her husband. He looked back at the room. Begin. Sunday came in soft and gold. Thomas suggested a walk, and Mia agreed, mostly because she could see how badly he wanted her to say yes. They went to Forsyth Park, where the live oaks threw long shadows and the old fountain hissed in the middle of everything. Thomas held her hand the whole way, walking slow to match her pace, pointing out a dog chasing a frisbee, a little girl losing a balloon to the sky. He was trying. She could feel the effort in it, the way he kept the conversation light and easy, steering it away from any edge that might cut. For a while it worked. Mia let the sun warm her face and let herself believe Friday night was already shrinking into the past, the way bad nights usually did. Then she noticed the boy. He was maybe 14, sitting on a bench with a friend, and he was looking at her. Not the casual glance strangers give. His eyes had caught on her face and gone wide, and now he was leaning toward his friend, talking fast behind his hand, his phone already half out of his pocket. The friend turned to look too. They both stared. Mia's stomach dropped. She knew that look. She'd been carrying it inside her since Friday, and now here it was on the face of a child who'd never met her, who only knew her as a clip on a screen, a woman with soda running down her face, a thing that had happened that people laughed at. "Thomas," she said quietly, "can we go?" He followed her gaze, saw the boys, understood at once. Of course. He kept his voice steady and turned them gently back toward the path, his hand firm at her back. He didn't look at the boys again, but Mia felt his arm go rigid under her fingers, just for a moment, before he made himself relax. She held it together until the grocery store. They stopped for a few things on the way home, ordinary things, bread and eggs and the coffee Thomas liked. Mia pushed the cart down the aisles and tried to feel normal. At the checkout, the young cashier scanned their items, and somewhere between the milk and the eggs, her eyes lifted to Mia's face and stayed there a beat too long. Then, they softened into something worse than mockery, pity. The girl gave her a small, sad smile, the kind you give someone at a funeral, and said, very gently, "You have a good day now, okay? You take care of yourself." And she meant it kindly. That was the unbearable part. She meant it as comfort, which meant she knew, which meant the whole town knew, and they had all decided what Mia was. The poor woman from the video. The one those boys did that to. Bless her heart. Mia got the bags to the car before she broke. She made it into the passenger seat, pulled the door shut, and then the sob came up out of her so hard it bent her forward. Thomas dropped the bags in the back and got in beside her and pulled her into his chest, and she cried into his shirt the way she hadn't let herself cry in front of him since Friday. "They all know," she choked out. "Everyone's seen it. That boy in the park, the girl in there, they all look at me like I'm something broken, like I'm pathetic. I can't go anywhere now. I can't even buy eggs without somebody feeling sorry for me." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I keep thinking, what did I do? I was nice to them. I was just doing my job, and I was nice, and they did that. And now I'm the one who has to walk around feeling ashamed. Why is it me carrying it? Why isn't it them?" Thomas held her and let her say all of it. He didn't rush to fix it. He didn't tell her she was wrong to feel it, didn't tell her to let it go, didn't offer any of the empty things people offer. He just kept his arms around her, solid as a wall, until the worst of the crying passed and she was breathing in ragged little hitches against him. "Listen to me," he said finally, his voice low. "What those boys did says everything about them and nothing about you. You hear me? Nothing. The shame they tried to hand you was never yours to carry. It was theirs. It still is. It doesn't feel like that. I know it doesn't." He smoothed her hair back from her wet face. "But it's the truth, and I need you to hold on to it even when it doesn't feel real yet." She nodded against him, not believing it, but grateful he'd said it. What she couldn't see was the thought turning over behind his eyes as he stared out the windshield at the parking lot. He had spent the last 2 days building a plan to take apart 3 fortunes. He'd thought that would be enough. He'd thought if he made those families bleed money, justice would be served and the matter would close. He understood now that he'd been solving the wrong problem. Money would punish the boys. It would not give Mia back the thing they'd taken, the way she could walk into a room without bracing for a stranger's eyes, the simple, ordinary dignity of being just a woman buying eggs. The video had rewritten her in the town's memory, and no amount of ruined permits or stranded cars would touch that. As long as that clip was the story people knew, she would keep being the woman it had happened to. So he would have to change the story itself. Not just punish them quietly, he would have to make the whole town watch a different ending, one where Mia walked away taller than all of them, and the three young men were the ones who couldn't show their faces. He held his wife a little tighter and started, in his calm and patient way, to plan it. Gerald Whitfield found out his world was tilting on a Tuesday morning, though he wouldn't understand that's what it was until much later. He was at his desk on the 4th floor of the Whitfield Development Building, coffee in hand, looking over the model of his newest project, a glass condominium tower on the riverfront that was going to make him another fortune. He'd already spent the money in his head. The loans were drawn against it, the contractors hired, the marketing brochures printed. All he needed was the final permits, and those were a formality. They were always a formality. He'd been greasing the same wheels in this town for 30 years. His assistant knocked and came in looking pale. "The permit office called," she said. "On the riverfront tower, and the Bay Street project, and the two on the south end." "And?" "They've all been flagged. Zoning review. They said there are irregularities in the filings going back years, and everything's frozen until it's resolved." Gerald laughed, the way a man laughs when he's certain he's about to fix something with one phone call. "Irregularities. Get me Pearson down at the office. He'll sort it in an hour." But Pearson didn't sort it. Pearson, it turned out, no longer had the authority. The review had been initiated by a county oversight contractor, a firm Gerald had never heard of, and the paperwork was airtight. Every project he had in motion was suddenly sitting still, and every day they sat still, the interest on his loans kept climbing while not a single dollar came in. By noon, he'd made 11 calls. By 2, he'd stopped laughing. By 4, he was sweating through his shirt because he'd done the math, and he understood that if this lasted even a few weeks, the leverage that held his entire company together would start to crack. What he could not figure out, no matter how he turned it, was why. He hadn't made any enemies. He hadn't crossed anyone. There was no rival, no jilted partner, no obvious hand behind it. The firm that flagged him was a clean little shell with a harborside address and a name that meant nothing. And when his lawyer dug into it, it simply dissolved into another company, and that one into another, until the trail went cold somewhere offshore. It was as if the trouble had come out of the air itself. He never once connected it to his son. Why would he? Chad had spent Friday night at the marina the way he spent every Friday night. Gerald didn't follow the local gossip pages. He had no idea there was a video, no idea his boy had poured a drink over a waitress and thrown money at her. To Gerald, the timing was just rotten luck. Across town, the Carrigans were having a worse day. Brody's father, Vincent, ran the 3 luxury dealerships the family had built over 2 generations. The business lived and died on inventory turning over fast. Sleek imported cars moving in through the port of Savannah, sitting on the showroom floor for a few weeks, then driving off in the hands of someone who'd paid too much. Vincent had 400 vehicles in transit at any given time, and every one of them came through the same carrier his family had used for 20 years. That carrier called Tuesday afternoon to cancel. Not in a month, not at the end of the contract. Effective immediately, citing a clause buried so deep in the agreement that no one had read it in years, the one that let them walk away with no notice if certain conditions were met. Conditions that, it seemed, had just been met.
"You can't do this," Vincent shouted into the phone. "I've got cars sitting at the port right now, millions of dollars of inventory. What am I supposed to do, push them up the highway myself?" The voice on the other end was polite and immovable. The contract was terminated. His vehicles would remain in the port holding yard, accruing storage fees by the day until he found another carrier. And every other carrier within 300 miles, when he started calling them in a panic, was somehow fully booked or quoting prices triple the going rate, or simply not returning his calls at all. His inventory was stranded. He could see the lot from a hill near the water if he drove out there. Rows and rows of cars he owned and couldn't move, sitting in the salt air, costing him money to do nothing. The whole machine of his business had seized up overnight, and like Gerald Whitfield,
Vincent Kerrigan spent the day chasing a reason and finding none. He blamed the economy. He blamed a competitor. He blamed bad luck and a careless contract clause his father had signed before he was born. He did not blame his son, because he didn't know there was anything to blame him for. Far away, in the quiet building at the edge of the port, Thomas read the day's reports without any particular pleasure. Delphine laid them out for him, one by one. The permits frozen, the carrier pulled, both families now thrashing in confusion, neither of them anywhere close to understanding what had hooked them. "Clean?" Thomas asked. "Spotless. Nothing leads back. They're chasing ghosts, and they'll keep chasing ghosts." He nodded. There was no smile, no satisfaction in it. To him, this was simply the work, methodical and quiet, the way a tide comes in so slowly you don't notice the water rising until your feet are already wet. And the boys? Still living like nothing's wrong. They don't feel it yet. The pressure's on the parents. "It'll reach them," Thomas said. "Money trouble always rolls downhill. When the cards stop working, they'll feel it." He set the folder down. "Let it sink in another day or two. Let the families really start to sweat. Then we tighten the next part." He looked out the window toward the water. "And keep watching the boys. I want to know the next time all three of them are in the same room." By Thursday, the three of them needed somewhere to hide from their own houses. Chad's home had become a war zone of phone calls and slammed doors, his father pacing the study at all hours, his mother whispering about whether they'd have to sell the lake place. Brody's family was no better, his father grey-faced and snapping at everyone, the dinner table silent and tense. Hunter's parents had started arguing about money in a way they never had before, the kind of arguing that has fear underneath it. None of the boys knew why. They only knew the air at home had turned to acid, and they wanted out. So they did what they always did when they wanted to feel like themselves again. They drove up to Hilton Head, to the country club lounge their families had belonged to for years, where the leather was soft and the drinks were expensive, and a man could forget that anything in the world was wrong. "It'll blow over," Chad said, dropping into a chair by the window. He still carried himself like he owned the place. "My dad's had bad stretches before, some zoning thing. It always works out." "My dad looks like he's about to have a heart attack," Brody muttered. "He's got like 400 cars stuck at the port. 400! "Stop talking about it," Hunter said. "That's why we came here, to not talk about it." He flagged down a server and ordered the most expensive bottle on the menu, because nothing made him feel better than spending money he hadn't earned. For about 40 minutes, it worked. They drank and laughed and talked about boats and a girl Hunter was seeing, and the lounge wrapped them in its familiar comfort. This was their world. It had always caught them, always smoothed things over, always reminded them that people like them landed soft. Then the manager came to their table. He was a trim, careful man in a pressed jacket, and he stood with his hands folded in front of him in a way that was polite and apologetic and completely final. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Chad blinked at him. "Excuse me?" "There's been a change in the club's membership policy. I'm afraid your family's memberships have been suspended, effective today. I can't allow you to remain on the property." He kept his voice low so the nearby tables wouldn't hear. "I really am sorry. This came down from the new ownership this afternoon." "New ownership?" Brody half stood. "My family's been members here for 15 years. My dad's on the board." "The board was dissolved this afternoon, sir. The club's debt was acquired by a private holding company, and they've restructured everything." The manager's eyes flicked toward the door, where two large, calm men in dark suits had appeared and were waiting without expression. "Please, don't make this difficult. There's no need for a scene." The three of them stood in a cluster of disbelief while every head in the lounge turned to watch them get walked out of a place they'd treated as their birthright. Chad's face went red. Hunter started to argue, then caught sight of the two men by the door and thought better of it. They were escorted across the soft carpet, past the bar, past people they knew, and out into the evening air. The doors closed behind them with a soft, expensive click.
"What the hell was that?"
Brody said, his voice cracked on it. "Some mix-up." Chad pulled out his wallet. "Forget them. Let's go to the Marina bar. I'll cover it." He held out his black credit card to no one in particular, the gesture pure habit, the way he'd waved money at problems his entire life.
Hunter was already staring at his phone.
"My card just got declined." He looked up, pale. "I tried to split the bottle in there. It got declined. I thought it was the machine." Chad's phone buzzed, then Brody's, then Hunter's again. 3 messages, near simultaneous, from 3 different sets of frightened parents, all saying versions of the same thing. "We've had to freeze the cards. Come home. We need to talk. Things are very bad, and you don't understand how bad." The 3 of them stood in the country club parking lot, under the security lights, holding cards that no longer worked, locked out of a building that had always been theirs, and for the first time in their lives, something cold and unfamiliar moved through them. It wasn't guilt. They still hadn't connected any of this to a waitress and a glass of soda. That Friday night had already faded from their minds, a forgettable bit of fun, nothing that should follow them anywhere. They didn't feel sorry. What they felt was smaller and more selfish than that. They felt the ground move. They felt, maybe for the first time ever, the particular fear of people who have always been protected suddenly discovering the walls are gone. "This is happening to all 3 of us," Brody said slowly, the math finally surfacing in him. "Same week. Your dad, my dad, Hunter's parents, all at once. Doesn't that seem—" "Coincidence," Chad said. But he didn't believe it, and his voice gave him away. A car they didn't recognize idled at the far end of the lot, parked, lights off, the silhouette of a driver behind the wheel doing nothing at all, just sitting. When Hunter glanced at it, the headlights flicked on, blinding them for a second, and then the car pulled out unhurried and drove away into the dark. None of them said anything about it, but they all felt watched, and they all hated the feeling, and they drove home that night in 3 separate cars, each one alone, with the sense that something enormous and invisible had taken notice of them and was not done. In the quiet building by the port, Delphine set down a single line of text in front of Thomas. "They've felt it now." "Good," he said. "Then it's time the parents heard the terms." The law firm occupied the top 2 floors of the oldest building on Bay Street, the kind of place with marble floors and a hush that made people lower their voices on instinct. The 3 families were brought in separately, 15 minutes apart, so they wouldn't see each other in the lobby. By the time all 3 were seated in the long conference room, the air between them was thick with suspicion. Gerald Whitfield came in first and was surprised to find Vincent Kerrigan already there. Then the Vances arrived, and the surprise curdled into something else. 3 families who barely knew each other, summoned to the same room on the same morning. None of them had wanted to admit how desperate they'd become, and now here they all were, sitting in their good clothes, trying to look like men who still had everything under control. At the head of the table sat a single attorney. He was older, immaculate, with silver hair and a face that gave away nothing. A leather folder rested closed in front of him. He did not introduce himself by name. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I represent an institutional investor who prefers to remain unnamed. My client has recently acquired a number of interests that affect each of your families. I'm here to discuss the terms under which those interests might be released." Gerald leaned forward. So it is one person. One person did all of this. He'd suspected it for days, and hearing it confirmed should have felt like relief. Instead, it made his skin crawl. Who? What do they want? If this is about money, name a number. It is not about money, the attorney said. My client has more than enough of that. This is about conduct. The word landed strangely in the room. The 3 sets of parents looked at each other, baffled. The attorney opened the folder, removed a single sheet, and slid it to the center of the table. It was a still image, printed in color. The inside of a diner. A young man holding a glass over a woman's head, soda mid-pour, her face frozen, two others laughing behind him. The room went very quiet. "Your sons," the attorney said. "2 Fridays ago, at a diner near the docks, they did this to a waitress who had done nothing but serve them and ask them to pay their bill. They recorded it. They posted it. They threw a $100 bill at her and left her on the floor. It has been viewed a great many times. I imagine you've all been too busy with your sudden financial troubles to notice." Vincent Kerrigan's mouth opened and closed. This is what this is about? A prank? You've frozen my entire business over kids being stupid at a restaurant? "My client does not consider it a prank," the attorney said, and for the first time something cold edged into his measured voice. "And I would advise you, sir, not to use that word again in this room." The Vances stared at the photograph. Hunter's mother put a hand over her mouth. The attorney let the silence stretch, then continued, calm again. "Here are the terms. They are not negotiable, and I will not repeat them. First, every project, contract, and account that has been frozen will remain frozen until these conditions are met in full. Second, your sons will perform 6 months of public community service, real work, cleaning the community center and the docks, where people can see them, not a check written to charity. Their hands, their time, their faces." He turned a page. "Third, and most important, the video will be answered with a public apology. The 3 of them will go to that diner, in front of the woman they humiliated, in front of her community, and in front of a local news camera, and they will apologize. Sincerely. Not a press release, not a statement read by a publicist. Them, in person, owning what they did. The footage of that apology will replace the footage of the act as the thing this town remembers." "And if we refuse?" Gerald asked, though his voice had lost its fight. The attorney closed the folder. "Then the foreclosure papers already drafted on each of your family estates will be filed at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Your loans will be called, your assets will be liquidated. By the end of the month, none of you will own the homes you slept in last night. My client has the means and the patience to see that through, and you have, by my estimate, no means to stop it." He folded his hands. "You have until 5. The choice is genuinely yours." The parents erupted. They demanded a name. They threatened lawyers, lawsuits, the police. The attorney listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had heard louder men make emptier threats. And when they finally ran out of breath, he said only, "There is nothing to investigate. Every transaction is legal. Every contract is valid. No law has been broken. You are free to spend the afternoon with your own attorneys confirming that. I'd suggest you spend it with your sons instead." It was Hunter's mother who broke it. She had been staring at the photograph the whole time, at her son's face caught mid-laugh, and something in her had gone quiet and ashamed. "We'll do it," she said softly. Her husband turned to her, and she met his eyes. "Look at it. Look at what he did. We'll do it." One by one, the others folded, not because they understood the size of the force arranged against them, and not because they suddenly cared about a waitress they'd never met. They folded because they were cornered and frightened and out of moves. But sitting in that hushed marble room, looking at the photograph of what their boys had done for fun, a few of them felt, for the first time, a thin and unfamiliar thread of genuine shame. The attorney gathered his folder and stood. "My client will know by 5, he said, and left them there with the photograph still lying in the middle of the table, none of them able to look away from it. 1 week after the soda hit the floor, Mia was working the Saturday morning shift when the bell above the door rang and the whole diner went quiet. She didn't notice at first. She was at the counter, refilling Earl's coffee, the old dock worker finally back on his usual stool, the white box of lemon tarts long since eaten and praised. It was the silence that made her look up. A room full of clatter and chatter doesn't just stop unless something pulls the air out of it. Chad, Brody, and Hunter stood just inside the door. They looked nothing like the young men from that Friday night. Gone with the pressed collars and the swagger, they wore plain clothes, simple and unremarkable, and each of them carried a bucket of cleaning supplies, mops and rags and bottles, held awkwardly in front of them, like offerings they didn't know how to give. Behind them came their parents, 6 people who looked like they hadn't slept in a week, faces drawn and pale. And behind the parents, setting up near the window, a young woman with a camera and the small logo of the local news station on her jacket. Mia set the coffee pot down, very slowly. For a moment, her body did the thing it had done in this same room a week ago. It went still and braced for something cruel. Her mind ran ahead to the worst of it. Another humiliation, a second round, the cameras here to catch her face crumpling all over again for the town to watch. But the 3 young men weren't laughing. They weren't even looking at each other for backup the way they had before. They were looking at the floor, at their own hands, at anything but her, and there was something in the set of their shoulders she didn't recognize. It took her a second to name it. They were afraid, and underneath the fear, something heavier. Chad stepped forward. His hands were shaking around the handle of the bucket. He set it down on the floor, and the small sound of it was loud in the silent diner. "Ma'am," he said. His voice broke on the word, and he had to start again. "Ma'am, there's no good way to say this. A week ago, I came in here and I poured a drink over your head, and my friends laughed, and we filmed it, and we left you on this floor like you were nothing. And you hadn't done one single thing to deserve it. You were kind to us. You were just doing your job." He stopped. His jaw worked. Whatever was happening to him in that moment, it didn't look rehearsed. "I've thought about it every day since," he went on. I used to think it didn't matter, that somebody like you wouldn't really, that it was just a joke." He shook his head, disgusted with the sentence he couldn't finish. "It wasn't a joke. It was a cruel thing I did to a good person because I thought I could, because I thought there'd never be any cost to it. I was wrong about everything, and I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear me say it." Brody went next, then Hunter, and neither of them hid behind Chad's words. They said their own. Brody couldn't meet her eyes, and apologized to the floor, his voice thick. Hunter cried partway through, and didn't try to stop it. The parents stood behind them, and Hunter's mother was crying too, one hand pressed to her chest. "We're going to spend the next 6 months cleaning the community center and the docks," Chad said, "where everyone can see. It's not enough, nothing's enough, but it's a start, and we're going to do it." The whole diner had turned to watch Mia. Earl had set down his coffee. The camera was rolling. And Mia stood behind the counter where, 1 week ago, she had been made to feel like the smallest person in the world. She thought, for a moment, about how much she had cried that week, about the boy in the park and the girl at the register and the pitying looks that had made her want to disappear. She thought about the version of herself that had knelt on this floor counting little anchors on the wallpaper so she wouldn't break in front of them. And she found, to her own surprise, that she wasn't that woman anymore. She came around the counter. The 3 of them flinched slightly as she approached, as if they expected her to shout, and she understood then that they'd braced for cruelty the same way she had. She stopped in front of Chad and looked up at him, this tall young man who had felt so enormous a week ago and looked so small now. "I accept your apology," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "I don't say that for you. I say it for me, because I'm not going to carry around what you did. That's yours now, not mine." She glanced at the other 2. "Do the work. Do it well. Become someone who'd never do this to anybody again. That's the only apology that counts in the end." She stepped back. Her head was high. The humiliation that had clung to her for a week, the thing she thought she'd carry for years, simply lifted, there in front of everyone, and was gone. The diner broke into something between a murmur and applause. Earl was on his feet, beaming, clapping his old hands. The camera caught all of it. Not a woman with soda running down her face, but a woman standing tall while 3 young men looked up at her and meant every word of sorry. By that night, a new video was moving through the town, and it had a different ending than the first. What no one in that diner knew, not Mia, not the news camera, not the 3 families still pale with confusion about how their world had been bent, was that a man stood across the street the whole time, watching through the window, his hands in his pockets, the faintest softness returning to a face that had been cold for a week. 3 weeks later, the old Anchor and Spoon diner was gone, and something far more beautiful stood in its place. The grease-stained walls had been stripped and painted a soft cream. The cracked vinyl booths were gone, replaced by little marble-topped tables and chairs with curved iron backs. Where the worn counter had been, a long glass case now ran the length of the room, and inside it sat rows of pastries so lovely they looked like they belonged in a painting. Lemon tarts with glossy tops, croissants folded into perfect crescents, cakes layered like small architectural wonders. The morning sun came through the new front windows and caught the gold lettering painted across the glass. Mia's Sweet Haven. She'd kept the font she'd chosen years ago. Mia stood in the middle of it all in a clean white apron, flour on one cheek, directing a small team of bakers with the easy confidence of someone who had waited her whole life to do exactly this. She showed a young man how to score the top of a loaf. She tasted a frosting and nodded her approval. She laughed at something one of them said, head thrown back, the sound of it filling the warm, bright room. Thomas stood near the door and watched her, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. He just looked at his wife being happy. She caught sight of him and crossed the room, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came," she said, kissing his cheek. "I wanted you to see it once everyone's here. It feels real now, with people working. It actually feels real." "It looks incredible," he said, and meant it. "You did this." "We did this." She squeezed his arm. "I still can't believe the loan came through the way it did. Honestly, Thomas, I'd given up. You hear about people waiting years, getting turned down again and again, and then your firm makes a couple of calls and suddenly there's funding and a renovation crew and a lease on the building." She shook her head, marveling. "Whoever you know in finance, I owe them a lifetime of free pastries." "I'll pass that along," Thomas said, with a small smile. She believed every word of it. To Mia, the story was simple and good. Her husband worked in logistics, and logistics meant he knew people. And one of those people had taken a chance on a tired waitress with a dream and a good recipe. She had no reason to look past it. The man who fixed the shed roof and brewed her chamomile tea did not seem like the kind of man who could bend a town to his will. That was exactly how he'd always wanted it. She went back to her baker's. Thomas watched her a little longer, then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped outside into the bright Savannah morning to take the call. The street was busy and ordinary. People walked past with shopping bags and coffee cups. A trolley rolled by full of tourists. No one gave Thomas a second look, which was the way it had always been and the way it would always stay. "It's me," he said quietly into the phone. It was Delphine. Her voice came through calm and even. The matter was closed, she told him. The permits had been quietly released back to the Whitfields once the apology aired and the community service began. The Carrigan cars were moving again. The country club had restructured under terms that no longer needed touching. The 3 families had their fortunes back, more or less, bruised but breathing, and not one of them had ever come close to learning whose hand had squeezed them. The shell companies had dissolved into nothing. The trail had gone cold the way fog burns off the water. There was no thread left for anyone to pull. "And the boys?" Thomas asked. "They were at the docks," she told him. "Every morning, 6 days a week, scrubbing and hauling and cleaning, exactly as promised. Word around town was that something in them had actually shifted. Chad had been seen helping an old man carry his groceries, with no one watching to be impressed by it. Whether it lasted or not, Delphine couldn't say.
But they were doing the work, and they were doing it where everyone could see, and the only video of them anyone talked about now was the one where they stood small in front of a waitress and meant their apology.
"Good," Thomas said.
He looked back through the window of the bakery, where his wife was laughing again, gesturing at a tray of fresh bread, glowing in a way he hadn't seen in years.
"Then it's done."
"It's done," Delphine confirmed. "Everything's back to normal. Quiet, clean, like nothing ever happened."
"That's how it should be." He paused, watching Mia hand a warm roll to one of the young bakers and pat his shoulder. "She's never going to know any of it. That's the way it stays. She thinks the world finally decided to be kind to her." Something in his voice was almost gentle. "I'd rather she believe that than ever know what it cost."
"She believes it," Delphine said. "Everyone does."
"Then we're done." He started to hang up, then added one last thing, his eyes still on the woman behind the glass. "Tell the directors thank you. They did this right. No noise, no trace. Just a man and 3 boys who learned the world isn't only built for them." A beat. And my queen, exactly where she belongs. Safe, happy, above all of it. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. For a moment, he stood in the sun and let himself simply be a husband again. All the cold patience of the last month folding away somewhere out of sight, perhaps for good, perhaps until it was needed again. Then he opened the door and stepped back inside, into the smell of fresh bread and sugar and the sound of his wife's laughter, where no one knew him as anything but the quiet man who loved her, and that was the only thing he had ever truly wanted them to believe. The bell above the door rang softly behind him. Inside Mia's sweet haven, the morning went on, warm and bright and entirely ordinary, exactly as it was always meant to.